I remember thinking, that night, that exhaustion had finally paid off, because as I sat alone in the dimly lit parking garage staring at the car I had just bought, my hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from a strange mix of pride and disbelief that I had actually pulled it off. For months I had been working insane hours, volunteering for projects no one else wanted, staying late while the cleaning crew vacuumed around my chair, telling myself it was temporary, that real men sacrificed now so their families could breathe later, and every skipped dinner, every cancelled plan, every quiet resentment I swallowed was justified by this moment. Lauren had always loved American sports cars, ever since we were dating, and she would slow down just to watch one pass, and I had memorized her favorite color years ago, so when the dealer pulled it into the light and I saw that exact shade reflecting back at me, it felt like proof that I was doing something right with my life. I imagined her face when she saw it, the laugh she made when she was genuinely surprised, the way she would probably cry and tell me I was crazy, and I told myself this was more than a gift, it was a symbol of stability, of us finally stepping into the version of adulthood we always talked about when we were younger and broke, sitting on the floor of our apartment eating takeout and dreaming about a house, a yard, maybe kids someday. I drove home late that evening, carefully, almost reverently, parking the car where she wouldn't see it yet, rehearsing how I would reveal it on our anniversary, feeling proud in a quiet, private way that didn't need validation because I believed, completely and without doubt, that I was building something solid. When I walked into the house, the familiar silence wrapped around me, and I chalked it up to different schedules and my own absence lately, kissing her on the cheek when I found her on the couch and apologizing, again, for working so much, promising that things would slow down soon. She smiled at me, the same smile I thought I knew by heart, and I remember thinking how lucky I was that she understood, that she supported me, that we were a team pushing through a hard season together. I ate dinner alone at the counter, too tired to notice how distracted she seemed, how her phone never left her hand, how the warmth I assumed was there had cooled into something practiced and distant. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, I mentally listed everything the car represented, the overtime checks, the future down payment, the unspoken promise that I was serious about us and willing to bleed a little now so we could be comfortable later. I felt exhausted but optimistic, convinced that all the strain was temporary and that marriages, like careers, went through rough quarters before they paid dividends. I had no idea, not even a flicker of suspicion, that while I was grinding myself down to prove my commitment, something essential between us had already cracked, quietly and without my consent, and that the life I was so confidently investing in had begun to unravel long before I ever turned the key in that car. When I walked into the house that night, something felt off in a way I couldn't immediately name, because the lights were on but the place was unnaturally quiet, and Lauren was sitting at the dining table with her hands folded, not scrolling on her phone, not pretending to be busy, just waiting, and that alone made my stomach drop before a single word was spoken. She didn't ask how my day was, didn't comment on how late it was, and when I sat across from her, she took a slow breath like someone about to deliver bad news they had already rehearsed 100 times. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, as she said she needed to talk, and then she told me she wanted to step away from our marriage for a while, not because of anything dramatic or explosive between us, but because her ex-boyfriend Derek had reached out and claimed that his life had fallen apart, his business was failing, and he had no one else to lean on. She explained it like a logistical problem, saying he needed emotional support, that he was fragile, that she felt responsible in a way she couldn't ignore, and she kept emphasizing that it was temporary, that nothing physical was supposed to happen, that she just needed space to be there for him until he got back on his feet. What stuck with me wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, with this strange certainty that I would understand, because she followed it up by telling me that I was strong, successful, self-sufficient, and that I didn't need her the way he did, as if my stability somehow made me expendable. I remember noticing how steady my hands were on the table, how my heart felt like it was slowing instead of racing, and how a heavy, numb calm settled over me as the final pieces clicked into place. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse her of anything, didn't ask her to reconsider, because in that moment it felt like whatever marriage I thought I was protecting had already ended somewhere far away from this conversation. I told her that if this was what she wanted, I wasn't going to stop her, and the look on her face shifted immediately, confusion flashing across it like she had expected anger or desperation and didn't know what to do with my acceptance. I stood up, told her I would grab some boxes, and asked which things she wanted to take tonight, watching her blink at me as if I'd just said something inappropriate instead of practical. As I packed her clothes in silence, she hovered in the doorway, visibly unsettled, asking if I was really okay with this, and I answered honestly that I didn't see the point in begging someone to stay when they were already halfway out the door. When she finally left, carrying a few bags and glancing back at me like she was waiting for a last-minute plea, I simply wished her well and closed the door behind her, feeling an eerie stillness settle over the house, the kind that comes not from peace, but from something breaking so cleanly that there's nothing left to argue over. After she left, the house didn't feel empty in a dramatic way, it felt paused, like everything was waiting for instructions that were never coming, and I started packing the rest of Lauren's things not because I was eager to erase her, but because motion was easier than sitting still with my thoughts. I moved methodically through the bedroom and closet, folding clothes the way I always did, noticing small details I had ignored for years, like how many outfits still had tags on them and how her taste had quietly shifted toward things I didn't recognize. When I reached her desk drawer, I found a crumpled receipt tucked beneath old mail, and at first it meant nothing to me until I actually read it and saw the name of an upscale restaurant I had never been to with her, dated weeks back, marked as a lunch for two with a total that made my stomach tighten. I stood there longer than I care to admit, holding that thin piece of paper, replaying my calendar in my head, knowing exactly where I had been that day, buried in meetings and deadlines, telling myself I was doing it all for us. That receipt cracked something open, and once it did, everything else started leaking through. A few days later, while carrying boxes to my car, one of our neighbors stopped me with that careful tone people use when they're not sure if they should speak, and after a moment of awkward hesitation, she told me she thought I should know that Lauren hadn't exactly been alone during the afternoons. She mentioned seeing her regularly with a well-dressed man, confident, relaxed, the kind of guy who didn't look like he was falling apart, and what stood out most was how he never drove the same car twice, cycling through luxury vehicles like they were accessories. I thanked her politely, because there was nothing else to say, and finished loading the boxes with a strange sense of clarity settling in, the kind that hurts but also simplifies everything. It became obvious that this wasn't some sudden act of compassion sparked by a desperate phone call from an ex, but a slow, deliberate emotional exit that had been happening while I was congratulating myself for being a good husband through sacrifice and endurance. Every late night at the office, every missed dinner, every moment I told myself love meant providing rather than being present suddenly took on a different meaning, and I realized that the conversation where she left wasn't the beginning of the end, it was just the first time she bothered to tell me. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt, replaced instead by a cold, focused resolve that made everything feel procedural rather than personal. I didn't call her, didn't demand explanations, didn't wave the receipt in her face or repeat what the neighbor had told me, because there was nothing left to salvage and no truth she could offer that would change the outcome. Instead, I called a divorce attorney, scheduled a consultation, and laid out the facts with the same efficiency I used at work, providing dates, assets, timelines, and documentation like I was closing out a project that had quietly failed. As I signed the initial paperwork, I felt an unsettling sense of control return, not because the situation was fair or painless, but because for the first time in months, I stopped reacting to someone else's choices and started acting on my own, accepting that the marriage I believed in had ended long before I ever realized I was standing in it alone. After the paperwork was filed and the reality of separation settled into something permanent, Lauren's presence in my life didn't disappear the way I expected it to, because instead of silence, my phone started lighting up more than ever, first with missed calls, then long voicemails, then late-night texts that bounced between confusion, nostalgia, and carefully worded regret. She asked how I was doing, told me she was thinking about us, reminded me of inside jokes and trips we had taken years ago, and occasionally cried without really saying why, but I kept my responses short, polite, and distant, not out of cruelty, but because I had learned that engaging emotionally only reopened wounds I was finally letting close. The more detached I became, the more frantic she seemed, like my refusal to fall apart was disrupting the narrative she had built in her head about how this was supposed to go. What I didn't expect was how quickly my own life began to stabilize once I stopped carrying the quiet weight of a marriage that had already checked out on me. Without the constant background stress of trying to be enough for someone who was slowly leaving, my focus at work sharpened in a way I hadn't felt in years, and projects that once felt overwhelming suddenly became straightforward challenges I could solve. I took on bigger responsibilities, delivered results that actually got noticed, and within months I was handed major accounts that usually went to people far above my level, followed by a bonus large enough that it made me sit in my car afterward just to breathe it in. I went back to the gym, not as a coping mechanism, but because I had energy again, and rebuilding my body felt like reclaiming something I had neglected while trying to hold everything else together. My social life followed naturally, reconnecting with friends I had slowly drifted from, accepting invitations instead of canceling them, remembering what it felt like to laugh without checking the time or apologizing for being distracted. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't rebuilding a life, I was uncovering one that had been buried under obligation and misplaced loyalty, and that realization made Lauren's increasingly emotional messages feel distant, like echoes from a room I no longer lived in. Through mutual acquaintances and fragments she let slip during her calls, I learned what was happening on her end, how her decision to help Derek had turned into something far more consuming than she ever admitted to me. She had started loaning him money, first small amounts she claimed were temporary, then tens of thousands of dollars pulled from her savings, followed by credit cards she quietly maxed out to cover his expenses, all for a man who always had an explanation and a promise that repayment was just around the corner. The stability she once assumed I would always provide was being poured into someone who never seemed to reach solid ground, and as her finances drained, so did her certainty, which only made her reach out to me more desperately. I listened without reacting when she talked about stress and bad luck, when she hinted that she missed the safety we used to have, and when she asked questions that sounded like fishing for reassurance, because by then I understood something she didn't, that walking away had forced me to grow in ways staying never would have, and while she spiraled trying to save someone else, I was quietly leveling up, not out of revenge, but because I finally had the space to become myself again. At my lawyer's suggestion, framed not as revenge but as risk management, I hired a private investigator, and even as I signed the agreement, I told myself I didn't care what he found, because by then my emotional involvement had thinned into something almost academic. The investigation didn't take long, which in itself said a lot, and when the report landed in my inbox, it read less like a mystery unraveling and more like a confirmation of what my instincts had already pieced together. Derek had never been broke, not even close, and the story about his life collapsing was a carefully curated performance designed to trigger sympathy and nostalgia rather than reflect reality. He was still earning well, still tied to profitable ventures, still owning property, still living comfortably enough to rotate cars and maintain the image of a man who was down on his luck only when it suited him. Page after page detailed bank records, business affiliations, asset ownership, timelines that overlapped too neatly with Lauren's financial withdrawals to be coincidental, and by the time I finished reading, there was no anger left in me, only a quiet sense of inevitability. He had identified her vulnerability, framed himself as a project in need of saving, and let her sense of loyalty do the rest, and the money she gave him hadn't gone toward recovery or rebuilding, but straight into maintaining the lifestyle he never actually lost. I closed the report and sat there longer than necessary, considering whether I should tell her, imagining the call, the confrontation, the moment of revelation that might spare her from what was coming. In the end, I chose silence, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I knew her well enough to understand that she wouldn't have listened, at least not to me. Any warning would have sounded like bitterness, control, or jealousy, and she would have dismissed it as an attempt to undermine her choices rather than a fact-based reality check. She had already rewritten our marriage in her head to justify leaving, and admitting she had been manipulated would have required confronting not just Derek's deception, but her own willingness to believe a lie that made her feel needed. I wasn't responsible for managing the consequences of a decision she had insisted on making alone, and stepping in would have only delayed an outcome she seemed determined to reach. Not long after that, the calls from her shifted again, this time edged with panic instead of nostalgia, and through fragmented messages and second-hand information, I learned that Derek had vanished completely. His number was disconnected, emails unanswered, accounts emptied, and the promises of repayment evaporated along with him, leaving behind over $25,000 in losses that she had no realistic way to recover. Her savings were gone, her credit cards were maxed out, and the stability she once described as something I didn't need had turned out to be something she underestimated losing. I didn't feel vindicated or relieved when I heard, just strangely detached, as if I were reading an update on a case file that had already been closed on my end. The investigation changed nothing about my path forward, but it clarified something important, that some truths arrive too late to be useful, and that trying to rescue someone from the consequences of their own choices can be another form of control. I had already let go of the marriage, and with it, the responsibility to protect her from realities she refused to see, accepting that the chapter she walked into without me was one she would have to survive on her own. The collapse wasn't dramatic or sudden, at least not from what I could see, but more like a steady erosion that stripped pieces of her life away one by one until there was nothing solid left to stand on. Word reached me gradually, through legal paperwork, mutual acquaintances, and the occasional message she sent that I no longer responded to, that Lauren had lost her apartment first, unable to keep up with rent once her credit was destroyed and her savings were gone. Her car followed soon after, repossessed quietly, turning mobility into another problem she hadn't planned for, and from there everything unraveled faster, because instability compounds itself in ways people don't appreciate until they're living inside it. She bounced between friends' couches at first, then cheap motels when the invitations ran out, and eventually spent nights sleeping in her car when she still had access to one, a reality so far removed from the certainty she once spoke with that it felt unreal even hearing about it secondhand. Her social circle thinned quickly, not out of cruelty, but exhaustion, because crisis has a way of draining everyone around it, and people who once praised her compassion now kept their distance when it became clear the situation wasn't temporary. Even her parents, who had always been a fallback in her mind, refused to step in beyond words, drawing boundaries she never believed they would enforce, and whatever safety net she assumed existed simply wasn't there when she finally needed it. I didn't celebrate any of this, but I didn't intervene either, because by then I understood that her fall was no longer connected to me, and reaching back would only entangle my life with consequences I hadn't created. On my end, things moved forward with an efficiency that felt almost surreal given what had come before. I legally changed the locks on the apartment after the required notices, not out of spite, but because it was the last shared tie that needed to be cleanly severed, and I finalized the divorce without contest, signing the final documents with a calm that surprised even my attorney. There were no dramatic negotiations, no emotional appeals, just a formal ending to something that had effectively been over long before the paperwork caught up. Around the same time, my career continued its upward trajectory, and I was offered a promotion that came with a significant salary increase, the kind that confirmed my instincts about what I was capable of once my energy wasn't being siphoned into a failing relationship. As the months passed, the contrast between our lives became impossible to ignore, not because I sought it out, but because it existed regardless of where I looked. The routines I had rebuilt solidified into stability, my work flourished, my health improved, and the future I had once envisioned as something we were building together was now unfolding without her in it. There was a quiet irony in realizing that the life she walked away from, convinced it didn't need her, not only survived her absence but thrived in it, growing stronger without the constant strain of trying to hold on to someone who had already let go. I didn't feel triumphant or bitter, just resolved, because the story had reached a point where outcomes were no longer about intention or fairness, but about momentum, and hers had been set in motion by choices she insisted on making, while mine carried me forward into a life that finally felt balanced, grounded, and entirely my own. For months after she walked out, I heard knocking on my door late at night, the kind that isn't impatient or aggressive, but hesitant, uneven, as if the person on the other side is already bracing for rejection, and when I opened it, I realized immediately that this wasn't a coincidence or a spontaneous visit, because Lauren wasn't alone. She looked thinner than I remembered, almost fragile, her face drawn and exhausted, eyes hollowed out in a way that spoke less about sadness and more about prolonged stress and survival, and behind her stood her mother, her sister, her best friend, and a mediator I recognized from earlier paperwork, all arranged like a quiet intervention meant to corner me with witnesses. The hallway light caught her as she stepped forward, and for a moment I barely recognized the woman I had once planned a future with, because desperation had stripped away the confidence she used to wear so easily. She didn't waste time pretending this was casual, breaking down almost immediately, apologizing, admitting she had made a mistake, telling me she hadn't understood what she was throwing away until it was gone, her voice shaking as she said she wanted another chance, that she was ready to come home, that everything she thought she needed had turned out to be wrong. Her mother watched me carefully, her sister looked tense and hopeful, her friend avoided my eyes, and the mediator stood there with a practiced neutrality that made it clear this was meant to apply pressure without overtly demanding anything. I listened without interrupting, letting her say everything she had clearly rehearsed, because I had learned that silence often reveals more than argument ever could. When she finally stopped, waiting for me to respond, I told her calmly that before anything else was said, everyone there deserved to know the full truth, not the edited version she had been living with. I explained that I had hired a private investigator months earlier, that Derek had never been broke, that his story about losing everything was a lie, and that while she was draining her savings and maxing out credit cards to save him, He had been living comfortably and preparing to disappear. I watched her face change as the reality settled in, watched her mother's expression harden and her sister's mouth fall slightly open, and I told them all that I had known this before Derek vanished, that I chose not to intervene because I understood she wouldn't have believed me then. Then I went to the drawer by the door and took out the car keys, setting them in my palm where everyone could see them, and I told them about the car I had bought months earlier, the one I had planned to give Lauren for our anniversary, the one purchased after countless late nights and sacrifices because I believed we were building a future together. I explained that when she left, the car stopped being a symbol of us and became a reminder of who I was willing to be for someone who didn't choose me back, so I kept it, not out of spite, but because I earned it, and because it now represented a life I was continuing on my own. The Mediator shifted uncomfortably, Lauren's mother looked away, and Lauren herself broke down completely, reaching for a version of me that no longer existed. I told her, evenly and without anger, that I wasn't taking her back, that love didn't survive abandonment followed by regret when consequences arrived, and that reconciliation wasn't something that could be negotiated with an audience or forced through collective pressure. I wished her well, genuinely, but I made it clear that the door she was standing in front of had closed months ago, not because I stopped caring, but because I started respecting myself. When I stepped back and closed the door, locking it behind me, I didn't feel victorious or cruel, only resolved, because for the first time since everything began to fall apart, my life was quiet, stable, and honest, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice that again for someone who only came back once there was nothing left to run to. When the door closed behind them that night, it wasn't slammed or dramatic, just a firm, final motion that felt heavier than any argument we ever had, and once the lock clicked into place, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not waiting for anything, but letting the silence settle into something real. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel torn between who I was and who someone else needed me to be, and when I went to bed, sleep came easily, without the usual replaying of conversations or imagined alternatives. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that surprised me, a calm certainty that I hadn't made a rash decision or acted out of pride, but had simply honored a boundary that should have existed all along. I made coffee, moved through the apartment at an unhurried pace, and noticed how peaceful everything felt without tension lingering in the corners, and later, almost on impulse, I grabbed my keys and went for a drive. The road opened up as the city thinned into wide stretches of countryside, fields and sky replacing traffic and noise, and as I drove, I let my thoughts wander without trying to fix or justify anything. I thought about how easily self-respect can be traded away when you believe loyalty means endurance at any cost, and how dangerous it is to assume that being stable makes you replaceable. I realized that boundaries aren't punishments, they're acknowledgments of reality, and that closing a door doesn't always come from anger, but sometimes from acceptance that reopening it would only lead back to the same place. Somewhere between the curves of the road and the steady hum of the engine, it became clear that I didn't feel joy about what Lauren was facing, no satisfaction in knowing she was left to rebuild her life alone, because suffering wasn't something I wished on her then or now. What I felt instead was clarity, the understanding that consequences aren't acts of cruelty, but the natural outcome of choices made with full agency. She chose another man, chose to believe a version of reality that allowed her to leave without guilt, and chose to assume that I would still be there if it all fell apart, and none of that made her irredeemable, but it did make her incompatible with the life I was determined to protect. As the miles passed, I accepted that moving forward didn't require resentment or constant reflection, just honesty about what I was willing to allow back into my world. Some chapters end quietly, without closure handed neatly to everyone involved, and some doors, once closed, stay that way not because they're locked from the outside, but because reopening them would mean walking backward into a version of yourself you've already outgrown. When I eventually turned back toward home, I felt grounded, free, and certain, knowing that whatever came next would be built on mutual choice rather than obligation, and that the peace I had found was something I intended to keep.